The candles were already lit when he walked in. 75 candles is too many to put on a cake, so my daughter Renee had arranged them in small clusters on the dessert table. Little pools of flickering light along the white tablecloth at Sycamore Grill in Asheville, North Carolina. The room was full. My sister Paulette had driven up from Columbia. My neighbor Frances had brought her husband Gerald, who was recovering from a knee replacement and used a cane but refused to miss it. My friend Loretta had come straight from church in her good blue dress. It was a Tuesday evening in October. Outside, the mountains were doing what they do in October, going orange and gold and unreasonably beautiful, as if they knew it was my birthday and wanted to put on something nice. I was holding a glass of Chardonnay. My attorney, Wallace Bridges, was sitting 2 seats to my left. He had represented me for 6 of the past 11 years, and I had invited him to dinner because he is a friend now, not just a lawyer. He knew everything. He had known for years. I was laughing at something Paulette had said when the door opened. And there was Charles, my son, 51 years old, the boy I had rocked through ear infections at 2 a.m. in a house in Knoxville, Tennessee, who had stood at my side when we buried his father, who I had not spoken to in 11 years. He was thinner than I remembered. His face had the particular worn look of a man who has not been sleeping. His shirt was slightly wrinkled. Dottie was behind him. His wife, my daughter-in-law, the woman who had once threatened me with a restraining order for asking to hold my own grandson. She was not looking at me the way someone looks at a person they have wronged. She was looking at me the way someone looks at a problem they need to solve. The entire restaurant went quiet, not all at once. It happened in a slow wave, the way quiet moves through a room when something shifts in the air. Charles's eyes were wet. He took 3 steps toward me, and then stopped as though he had rehearsed this moment but forgotten his line when the actual moment arrived. He said, "Mom, we have nowhere to go. The IRS took everything. You have to let us in." 11 years. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Not, "I have missed you." We have nowhere to go. I looked at Dottie. She was looking at the floor. I thought about the last time I had seen her face. I thought about the word she had used. Intruder. She had called me an intruder in the driveway of the house where my grandson was sleeping when I had driven 4 hours to bring him a birthday gift on his 3rd birthday. I set my wine glass down very carefully on the tablecloth. I turned to Wallace. I said, "Wallace, call the police. We have intruders." The room went completely still. Charles's mouth opened. I picked my wine glass back up. I looked at my sister Paulette, who was watching me with her eyes wide and her hands folded on the table. I said, "Now, where were we?" Before I tell you what happened next, and I will tell you everything, I need to take you back 11 years. Because the woman who sat at that table in October is not the woman who drove away from her son's house on a cold February morning in Tennessee. She is someone entirely different, and the distance between those 2 women is the whole story. February, 11 years ago, my husband Raymond had been gone for 14 months. Raymond Carpenter. We had been married 38 years. He was a civil engineer who built bridges, actual ones in Tennessee and North Carolina and 3 counties in Virginia, and he had the kind of patient, methodical mind that people who build bridges tend to have. He thought before he spoke. He did not rush conclusions. He died of a second heart attack on a Monday morning in his home office at his desk with his reading glasses still on. I was 64 years old when I became a widow. I had worked as a licensed social worker for the city of Knoxville for 29 years. I had a case file brain. I tracked people, systems, patterns. I did not miss things. Charles called me 3 weeks after Raymond's funeral and said there was a spare room in his house in Franklin, Tennessee, 30 miles south of Nashville. He and Dottie had bought a 4-bedroom house 2 years earlier. The boys, my grandsons, Marcus and little Theo, were 4 and 2. Charles said, "Come stay for a while, Mom, just until you figure things out. The boys would love having you close." He sounded like he meant it. I believed he meant it. I should have talked to Dottie first. On that call, Dottie was not there. I moved in with 1 carload of things and a plan to stay 3 months. 3 months became 5. 5 became 8 because Theo had a respiratory illness that kept him home from daycare. And I was there, and I helped, and it felt like being needed in a way that was good for me that winter. And then something changed. The first thing I noticed was the calendar. Dottie kept a wall calendar in the kitchen, color-coded, 1 color per family member. The boys were blue and green. Charles was orange. Dottie was red. My activities were never on the calendar, not because she forgot to add them. She had added the plumber, the HVAC service, a dentist appointment for the dog. She had simply never given me a color. I noticed. I said nothing. It seemed small. The second thing was the grocery list. I had been cooking 3 nights a week since I arrived, not because anyone asked me to, but because I liked to cook and the boys liked to eat, and it seemed like a fair exchange for a spare bedroom. I went to the store on Fridays with a list of what we needed. One Friday, Dottie handed me a printed list, her list typed specific with brands named, and said, "I'd rather you just get what's on here from now on. It makes things simpler." I took the list. I bought everything on it. I said nothing. It seemed small. The third thing was not small. 8 months after I moved in, I overheard Dottie on the phone. I was not eavesdropping. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen on my way to the boys' bathroom with a stack of folded towels. Her voice was crisp and clear. She said,
"She doesn't have anywhere else to go, which is the problem. If I ask her to leave, Charles feels guilty, and I don't want to fight about it. I'm just going to make it uncomfortable enough that she decides on her own."
I stood in that hallway with my grandson's towels in my arms, small ones, the ones with the little frog pattern on the corner that I had bought them at the Target on Cool Springs Boulevard. And I listened. I heard the rest of the sentence. She said, "I need her gone by summer. I have a cousin who needs the room." The cousin never did move in. That part, I found out later, was a story she was telling whoever was on that phone. The room was not for a cousin. The room, I eventually understood, was never the point. The point was that I was in it. I went to the bathroom. I put the towels away. I came back to the kitchen, and I said, "Dottie, what would you like for dinner?" And she said, "Oh, whatever's easy." And I made chicken and rice. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what those months were. Not dramatic, not one big explosion. Small things, accumulating quietly the way dust accumulates on the top of a refrigerator. You don't see it building up, and then one day you look and realize it has been there for months. The night everything changed was a Thursday in February. Charles was working late. The boys were in bed. I was in the living room reading when Dottie came in, sat down across from me, and said, calmly, professionally, the way she said everything, that she thought it was time for us to talk about my long-term plans. I put my book down. She said she had been thinking about it for a while. She said Charles was stressed about the finances of having an extra person in the house. She said she had done some research, and there was a very nice senior living community in Brentwood, Tennessee, that offered independent living apartments at a reasonable rate. I said, "Dottie, I'm 64. I'm not going to a senior living facility." She said,
"Well, something needs to change. I think you'll agree this situation isn't sustainable."
I said, "I'm happy to find my own place. I've been looking. I just haven't rushed because Charles said there was no rush." She said,
"Charles is not always realistic about these things."
There was a pause. I looked at her. She looked at me. I said, "How long?" She said, "End of the month would be ideal." It was the 14th of February. I said, that's 2 weeks. She said, I know, I'm sorry it's short notice. She didn't look sorry. She looked like a woman who had just completed an unpleasant task efficiently. I said, I'll start making calls in the morning. She said, thank you for being reasonable. I went to my room. I did not call Charles that night. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand, and I thought about what Dottie had said when she was on the phone in the kitchen. I need her gone by summer. She had started this before she had even had the conversation with me. She had a plan and a timeline, and she had executed it on Valentine's Day because she was thorough like that. Raymond would have known what to do. Raymond always knew what to do. I sat in the spare room of my son's house and I talked to Raymond in my head the way I had been talking to him since the Monday he died at his desk with his glasses on. And what I heard back, quiet but clear, was, Christina, make the calls. Don't wait. I made the calls. I found an apartment in 6 days. 1 bedroom on Nolensville Pike in Nashville. Not fancy, but clean and mine. I gave Dottie 10 days notice instead of 2 weeks because I refused to be in that house on the last day of February feeling like I was being counted down. Charles helped me move. He was quiet the whole day, that particular quiet of a man who has made a choice he doesn't fully understand yet. He carried boxes. He set up my kitchen table. He hugged me before he left and said, I'll call you Mom. He called twice in the first 3 weeks. Then once in April. Then nothing. The calls stopped because Dottie stopped them. I don't know exactly how. I didn't need to know exactly. I know my son. And I know that Charles has always been the kind of man who finds it easier to go along with what the room requires than to fight for what he believes. Raymond called it conflict avoidant. I just called it Charles. In September, 7 months after I moved out, Marcus turned 5. I drove to Franklin with a gift, a wooden train set, the kind with the magnetic cars that I knew Marcus loved because I had watched him play with one at the library. I drove 4 hours. I pulled into the driveway. Dottie came out of the front door before I had finished turning off the engine. She said, Christina, you can't be here. I said, it's my grandson's birthday. She said, you should have called first. I said, I did call. I left a message on Tuesday. She said, I didn't get it. I said, Dottie, I just want to give Marcus his birthday gift. I drove 4 hours. She said, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't, I'm going to call the police and file for a restraining order. I have documentation that you've been harassing us. I stood in that driveway. September sun. Hot. A neighbor across the street was mowing his lawn, and the sound of it was very loud. I said, harassing you? She said, I have a record of your calls. Charles has told me he's asked you to give him space. Charles had not asked me anything. Charles had stopped calling. I looked at her. I looked at the front door, which was closed. I thought about Theo, 3 years old, in there somewhere, a little boy who had called me Nana and climbed into my lap every evening for 8 months. I thought about Marcus, who was turning 5, and who I had not seen in 7 months. I put the train set back in the car. I said, Dottie, I want you to hear me, not because I'm angry, and not because I'm going to do what you're suggesting I would do. I want you to hear me because you should know who you are talking to. I have been a social worker for 29 years. I know every single thing you are doing, and I know its name. And I want you to know that I know. She said nothing. I said, tell Marcus happy birthday. I drove 4 hours home. I put the train set in my closet. I did not cry until I was inside with the door locked. And then I cried for a long time, not the messy kind of crying, just the slow, quiet kind that comes when something you already knew becomes impossible to pretend you don't. After that, Dottie filed the paperwork for a restraining order. Charles signed it. The order was not granted. The judge found insufficient grounds, but the fact that Charles had put his name on that document told me everything I had not wanted to know about where my son was standing. I filed the copy of the rejected order in a folder. I labeled the folder. I put it in my filing cabinet. 29 years of social work had taught me one thing above everything else. Document everything. Don't make noise. Don't perform your anger. Just document and wait and know that clarity has a long shelf life. I waited. People think estrangement from a child is just sadness. They think it is one long grief, constant and flat like a gray sky. It is not like that. The first 2 years were the hardest, and even then, not in the way I expected. The hardest part was not missing Charles, though I did miss him, the way you miss a version of a person you may have overestimated. The hardest part was Marcus and Theo. Those two little boys were in a house I could not enter, growing up in years I could not witness. Marcus starting school, Theo losing his baby teeth, moments that nobody was going to tell me about. I gave myself the first year to grieve it. I set aside time, Sundays after church, to let myself feel what I felt without managing it or explaining it away. Then I got up on Monday and went to work. I had taken a position with a nonprofit in Nashville called Family Bridge. We worked with families in crisis, housing instability, domestic situations, elder care disputes. I had been doing this work for decades, but this was the first time I was doing it with something I had learned personally, not just professionally. In year 3, I started a subgroup within Family Bridge, women over 60 who had been cut off from their grandchildren. We met on Wednesday evenings in a community room at a church on Charlotte Avenue. 6 women the first night, 14 by the second month. I want to tell you about one of those women because she matters to this story. Her name was Sylvia Hargrove. She was 68, retired from 30 years as a postal supervisor. And she came to the first meeting with a folder under her arm, documents organized with sticky tabs, because she had read that documentation was important and she was not going to come unprepared. She was a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and the particular posture of someone who has spent decades standing at counters dealing with difficult people and has never once let one of them see her flinch. Her son and daughter-in-law had moved her grandchildren, 3 of them, to Colorado 18 months earlier without telling her. She had found out from a Christmas card returned with a forwarding address. She sat across from me at that table, her folder open, her handwriting neat on the tabs, and she said, "I did not come here to feel sorry for myself. I came here because I need to know what to do." I said, "That's exactly why this room exists." We worked with Sylvia for 8 months. She retained a family law attorney in Nashville named Dwight Monroe, who specialized in grandparental rights. The case was not simple. Tennessee law on grandparental visitation rights is limited, and Sylvia had an uphill climb. But Dwight found a pathway using documented prior relationship, and 14 months after Sylvia walked into that community room with her tabbed folder, she had a court-ordered visitation schedule. Every other month, 3 days. The children flew to Nashville. The first time her youngest grandchild walked off the plane, Sylvia called me from the airport. She didn't say much. I could hear a child's voice in the background saying, "Grandma." That was enough. That call is the reason I kept showing up on Wednesday evenings. In year 6, I was contacted by a researcher at Vanderbilt University, a Dr. Melanie Osei, who was studying grandparent estrangement and its psychological and financial impacts. She had found the Family Bridge group through a social worker referral. She asked if I would contribute to a study she was preparing. I agreed. I contributed what I knew professionally and, where relevant, personally. The study was published in a journal 2 years later. My name was in the acknowledgments. My experience was cited in aggregate in the findings. I did not know then what would come of that citation. In year 8, I retired from Family Bridge at 72, not because I was done, but because I had bought a small house in East Nashville on Fatherland Street with a covered porch and a vegetable garden in the back. And I wanted time in it. I had purchased it with money I had saved, money I had managed, money that no one had any hand in but me, a 2-bedroom craftsman with original hardwood floors and a kitchen window that faced the garden. I grew tomatoes. I grew peppers and squash, and the particular variety of pole bean my mother had grown in her backyard in Chattanooga. I made Sunday dinner for myself and whoever came. Paulette came at Thanksgiving. Loretta and her husband Dennis came for 4th of July. Francis and Gerald became regulars Friday evenings on the porch. I had a life. I want to be clear about this because I think some people assume that 11 years of estrangement is 11 years of waiting. It was not waiting. It was living. There is a difference, and the difference matters. I was not sitting by the window watching for Charles. I was in the garden. I was on the porch. I was on the phone with Sylvia, who had been promoted to a supervisory role in our Wednesday group. I was sleeping through the night. Charles existed for me the way a scar exists. You know it's there. You can feel it when the weather changes, but it does not stop you from using the hand. I was using my hand. In the spring of year 9, something happened. Renee, my daughter, 47, who lives in Asheville and teaches 6th grade science, and has been the steady, sane center of my family for as long as she has been alive, called me on a Sunday afternoon. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something that might upset you. I want you to hear it from me." I said, "Go ahead, baby." She said, "Charles called me. He's in trouble, real trouble, and I think he's been trying to find you." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "What kind of trouble?" Renee told me what she knew, which was not all of it, but enough. Charles and Dottie had been running a financial advisory business out of Franklin for 8 years. The business had grown, clients, referrals, a second office in Brentwood. And somewhere along the way, according to what Renee had pieced together from what Charles told her and what she had found in the news, the business had made some significant errors. The IRS kind of errors. Charles had not called me directly. He had called Renee because he knew Renee would tell me, and telling me through Renee was easier than calling me himself after 11 years of silence. I said, "What does he want?" Renee was quiet for a second. Then she said, "He didn't say directly, but, Mom, I think he wants to come home." I sat on my porch with the phone in my hand. It was May. The garden was coming in. The pole beans were up. A cardinal was in the maple at the fence line, red as a stop sign. I said, "Renee, does he know about my birthday dinner?" She said, "I mentioned it. I told him you were turning 75 in October, and that we were doing dinner in Asheville." I said, "And..." She was quiet again. I said, "Renee..." She said, "He asked if he could come." I sat with that for a long time. A man who had put his name on a restraining order to keep me away from my grandsons was now asking, through my daughter, through the back channel of family softness, if he could come to my 75th birthday dinner. I said, "I need to think about it." I also called Wallace Bridges that week. Wallace had become my attorney when I needed help with a property dispute in year 6, and had stayed on for general counsel since. He was 63, a careful man, the kind who read things twice before he commented. I told him about the call from Renee. I told him what she'd said about Charles's business. I said, "What do I need to know before October?" Wallace did some research over the next 2 weeks. He came back to me with a memo, 3 pages, single-spaced, Wallace style, that laid it out. The IRS had opened an investigation into Charles and Dottie's firm 18 months earlier. Unreported income, misclassified expenses, and one item that Wallace called significantly problematic, an arrangement in which client funds had been moved through accounts in a way that benefited the principals. The accounts had been frozen. The firm was under audit. Their personal accounts were frozen as well, pending resolution. Charles and Dottie had been living on Dottie's mother's credit, which had a limit. That limit had been reached. Wallace said, "Christina, these people are not coming to your birthday dinner to celebrate. They are coming because they have run out of other doors." I said, "I know that." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to have my birthday dinner. I want Paulette and Loretta and Francis and Gerald and Renee. I want Chardonnay and the salmon and the chocolate cake. And I want you there, Wallace." He said, "And Charles?" I said, "I'm not going to stop him from walking in, but I want you beside me when he does." Wallace said, "I'll be there. There is something I need to say here because I think it matters. I was not planning a scene. I was not plotting a public humiliation. I had a birthday dinner. I had a life that I had built. Charles walking into that room, whether he came or not, was not going to change either of those things. What I had decided was simply this. I was not going to pretend. I was not going to smooth it over and hug him at the door and set a place at the table as though 11 years had not passed, as though Marcus and Theo had not grown up without me, as though Dottie had not stood in a driveway in September with a threat on her lips while I held a train set. I was going to be exactly who I was. And if he walked in, he was going to see that clearly. He came in at 7:22. We had been at the table since 6:45. I heard the door before I saw him. That specific sound of a restaurant door opening and a slight shift in the room's air. Paulette noticed first, because Paulette notices everything. She touched my arm very lightly, and I turned. Charles was standing just inside the entrance. He was wearing a blue sport coat that was slightly too large. He had lost weight. Dottie was behind him in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back. She looked like she was preparing for a business meeting. He scanned the room and found me. Our eyes met across the restaurant, and for one moment, just one, he looked exactly like the boy who had fractured his wrist falling out of a tree at age 9 and tried not to cry all the way to the emergency room because he was embarrassed. Then he started walking toward me. The table went quiet. Loretta put down her fork. Gerald stopped mid-sentence. Renee, sitting to my right, did not move. Charles stopped 2 feet from the table. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the edges. He said,
"Mom, the IRS froze our accounts. We've lost everything. We have nowhere to go. You're the only one. You have to let us in."
Dottie, standing behind him, said nothing. She was looking at the tablecloth. I did not speak immediately. I let it settle. Loretta has told me since that the silence lasted about 8 seconds, but it felt much longer to the people at that table. Then I looked at Dottie. I said, "Dottie, did you bring the restraining order you threatened me with? The one from September, when I drove 4 hours to bring Marcus a birthday gift. And you told me you'd have me arrested for harassment." The table next to ours had gone still. The couple on the other side of the low divider had stopped talking. I could feel the entire room listening. Dottie said nothing. Charles said, "Mom, please." I said, "Charles, I am not finished." He stopped. I said, "You put your name on that document. You signed your name to a legal claim that I was harassing you. Your children grew up without their grandmother because you signed your name to that document. I want you to look at me and tell me, did I deserve that?" His jaw moved. No sound came out. I said, "That is the conversation I will have with you. That conversation, eventually with honesty, is one I am willing to have. But not here. Not tonight. Tonight is my birthday. These are my people." I turned to Wallace. I picked up my wine glass. I said clearly and calmly, "Wallace, would you please call the manager? We have 2 people who are not on the reservation." Wallace was already on his feet. He was not calling the police. I had not actually said police, though I imagine it landed that way. He was doing what I had asked, which was to make it clear politely and professionally that this was not a welcome arrival. The manager came. He was a young man, 20-something, visibly uncomfortable. He spoke quietly to Charles. Charles looked at me one more time. I met his eyes. I did not look away. I did not look angry. I looked like myself, which after 11 years of building a life without him in it, was a woman who did not need him to complete anything. He left. Dottie left without saying a word. The door closed. The table held its breath for another moment. Then Paulette reached across and put her hand over mine. She said, "You all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You sure?" I said, "Get the waiter. It's time for the cake." And we had the cake. 75 candles in clusters along the white tablecloth. Loretta sang the first 2 lines of Happy Birthday, and everyone joined in. Renee cried a little. Renee always cries at celebrations. It's her nature. Gerald made a toast that was too long but heartfelt. Francis took photographs. It was a good birthday dinner. I drove back to Nashville the next morning. Renee had offered her guest room, but I wanted my own bed, my own kitchen, my own porch. For hours south, straight down I-26 to I-40, I had the radio on low, and I thought about Charles the entire way. Not with anger. I want to be precise about that. What I felt driving home was something closer to grief, the specific kind that comes when you have hoped in some part of yourself you haven't fully admitted to that a person would show up differently, and they didn't. He had come to that restaurant with 11 years of silence behind him, and his first sentence had been, "You have to let us in." Not, "I have missed you." Not, "I was wrong." "You have to let us in." I thought about that on I-40, and I thought about it sitting on my porch that evening, and I thought about it lying in bed, and I decided that I was going to write him a letter. I write letters when things matter. I have always believed that email is for information and letters are for truth. Letters cost you something, the time, the paper, the act of folding and sealing and walking to a mailbox. That cost makes you choose your words more carefully. I wrote 2 letters, one to Charles, one to Dottie. Dottie's letter was short. It said, "Dottie, I am not writing to reopen anything that has been closed. I am writing because I want you to know one thing. I spent 29 years as a social worker. I know what coercive control looks like. I know what a paper trail assembled against an inconvenient person looks like. I know what a threatened restraining order is designed to accomplish when the grounds don't actually exist. You were not subtle. You were efficient. I will give you that. But I am not confused, and I was never declining. I just stopped being in your way. That is all this was. I hope you understand that now. Christina Carpenter." Charles's letter took me longer. The part that mattered said, "Charles, I am your mother. That does not expire. I am not writing to punish you, and I am not writing to make you feel worse than you already do. I am writing because you drove to Asheville and stood in a restaurant and said you had nowhere to go, and I need to answer that properly. Here is my answer. There is always somewhere to go when you tell the truth. The truth I need to hear from you, the one I needed to hear 11 years ago and did not, is not complicated. It is 2 words. You know what they are. When those 2 words come, not performed, not strategically timed, but actually true, I will hear them. I am not close to you, Charles, but I am also not the woman who will open the door before you have knocked honestly. Mom. I mailed them on a Thursday. 3 weeks went by. I planted the fall garlic. I had Francis over for soup. I called Paulette. I did not wait by the mailbox. In the 4th week, a letter came. Charles's handwriting, small, cramped, has always been cramped since he was 7 years old and held the pencil too tight, and his teachers used to tell him to loosen up. I brought it inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. His letter was 2 pages. The second page said, "Mom, I am sorry. I don't know how else to start. I knew what Dottie was doing. I didn't know all of it, but I knew enough. I told myself it was complicated, that there were reasons, that you were difficult. And I knew even while I was telling myself that it wasn't true. I chose easy over honest. I did it for years. I signed my name to something I should never have signed. And while I was making myself comfortable with bad decisions, my boys grew up without their grandmother. Marcus is 17. He has asked me about you 3 times in the last year. I did not know what to tell him. That is the thing I am most ashamed of. Not the IRS, not the business, that I did not know what to tell my 17-year-old son about his grandmother. I'm sorry, Mom. I know it's late. I know it might not be enough, but it's true. Charles. I read it twice. Once fast, once slow. Then I sat with it. The apology was real. I could feel the difference between a real apology and a managed one. I had seen enough of both in 29 years of social work to know which was which. This was not timed for legal strategy. It was not crafted to minimize exposure. It was a man saying something true in cramped handwriting because he had run out of other options. And the only thing left was honesty. I put the letter in a drawer, next to the folder with the rejected restraining order, next to Raymond's reading glasses, the ones he had on the morning he died. I did not write back that week. I am not a woman who rushes the things that matter. But I left the drawer open a little. The call came on a Saturday morning in November. It was not Charles. It was not Dottie. It was Marcus, my grandson, 17 years old. He had found my number through Renee, who had given it to him with, she told me later, a single instruction: call her directly. Don't make her wait. His voice was young and careful, the particular carefulness of a teenager trying to sound like an adult because the subject is too important to risk sounding young. He said, "Grandma Christina, this is Marcus, Charles's son." I said, "I know who you are, Marcus. I have always known who you are." There was a pause. Then he said, "I know you don't know me. Not really. But I've been thinking about you for a long time. My dad told me some stuff, and I'm old enough to understand what happened. What was done. I just wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to hear your voice." My hand tightened on the phone. He said, "Is that weird?" I said, "No, baby, that is not weird at all." We talked for 40 minutes. He told me he was a junior in high school, that he played basketball, that he wanted to study environmental science in college. He told me he had a dog named Hank. He told me his little brother Theo, now 14, was funny and terrible at video games and had their father's habit of making faces when he thought something was a bad idea. He talked the way young people talk when they are finally allowed to talk about something they have been carrying for a long time. At the end, he said, "Grandma Christina, can I come see you sometime? Like, actually come to Nashville?" I said, "Marcus, you can come any time you want." He said, "Even Theo?" I said, "Especially Theo." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Okay, I'm going to call you again. Is that okay?" I said, "That is very okay." He said, "Okay, good. Bye, Grandma." He hung up. I sat on my porch for a long time after that call. It was November, cold enough for a jacket, and the garden was put to bed for the winter, and the maple tree at the back fence had lost its leaves. The yard looked sparse and clean, the way things look when they have been properly prepared for rest. I thought about Sylvia Hargrove, who had driven to the airport and heard her grandchild say, "Grandma." I thought about the community room on Charlotte Avenue. I thought about all the women who had sat in that circle on Wednesday evenings and said, "I just want to hear their voices." I had heard his voice. He had asked to call again. Some things come late. That does not make them less real. 3 weeks after Marcus called, Charles called. He called on a Sunday morning, which was Raymond's day, the day Raymond and I used to sit on the back porch with coffee and the newspaper, and not talk much, which was the particular kind of company we were best at together. Charles said, "Mom, I don't expect you to have an answer. I just need to say I know what I did. Not just with the restraining order. All of it. I watched Dottie build a life that didn't include you, and I told myself it was just how things were. And I knew better the whole time. I could have called you. I didn't. That's on me, not her. I said, 'Charles, tell me about Marcus. Tell me about Theo.' He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked for an hour. He told me about Marcus's basketball season and Theo's science fair project about water filtration. He told me Theo had recently developed a passion for cooking from watching YouTube of all things and had made a passable chicken stir-fry the previous Tuesday and been impossibly proud of himself. I let him talk. I did not make any promises. I did not say everything was forgiven because it was not all forgiven yet, and I was not going to say something untrue to make the moment easier. But I let him talk, and I talked back. I told him about the garden, about the pole beans, about Francis and Gerald and the Friday porch evenings, about Sylvia and the Wednesday group. At the end, he said, "Mom, what would it take?" I said, "Time, Charles. Consistent, honest time. No managed effort. No strategy. Just you telling the truth for as long as it takes." He said, "I can do that." I said, "Show me." He has been showing me, slowly, imperfectly, the way honest things tend to move. I want to talk to you directly, not about my story anymore, about yours. Because if you are still listening, and I know you are because I know the kind of woman who stays until the end, then something in this story found you. And I want to make sure you leave here with something real. First, I want to tell you what 11 years of standing your ground actually costs. It costs you the habit of picking up the phone on Sunday mornings and then remembering that there is no one on the other end. It costs you every holiday twice, once when it happens, and once in the week before, when you are quietly managing your own expectations so that the day doesn't undo you. It costs you the particular kind of loneliness that has no easy name, the loneliness of someone who chose self-protection and knows it was right and still feels the weight of it. I am not going to tell you that weight is light. It isn't. But here is what standing your ground pays. It paid me a house on Fatherland Street that is mine. Every room arranged the way I want it. Every decision mine alone. It paid me a garden with Raymond's beans in it. It paid me 40 Wednesday evenings a year in a community room on Charlotte Avenue, sitting across from women who needed to hear that what happened to them has a name, and they are not crazy. It paid me Sylvia Hargrove, saying, "I came to hear what to do," and then going home to her own house with a court-ordered schedule. It paid me a phone call on a Saturday morning from a 17-year-old boy with his grandfather's voice saying, "I just wanted to hear your voice." The math is not clean. There is no version of this where nothing was lost. But I came out ahead, and I want you to know that is possible. Now, the practical things. The things I wish someone had put in my hands the night I stood in that spare room in Franklin and understood what was being done to me. Number one, if someone is pushing you to sign a document and calling it routine, it is not routine. Nothing that affects your financial life, your medical decisions, or your legal autonomy is routine. Take the document. Walk out of the room with it. Call an attorney who has no connection to your family. Every state bar association in this country has a referral line for elder law attorneys. 1 hour of consultation, which costs far less than you think, can tell you whether what you're being handed is standard or strategic. Do not sign anything under time pressure. A person who loves you will wait 3 weeks for your considered decision. A person who is managing you cannot afford to wait. Number two, know your accounts. Know every account in your name, the institution, the balance, the login, the authorized contacts. Keep a written record of this information somewhere outside your home if your home is shared with someone you are uncertain about. A safe deposit box, a trusted friend's keeping, anywhere that is yours alone. Evelyn Shiner in that other story kept a handwritten ledger. That ledger protected a woman from 400 miles away after Evelyn was already gone. Be your own Evelyn. Write it down. Number 3, know what a power of attorney actually means. It gives another person extraordinary access to your bank accounts, your investment accounts, your healthcare decisions, your property. It is not a form you sign because someone says it will simplify things. You sign it if you sign it at all because you have chosen the right person with full understanding, reviewed it with an independent attorney, and are doing it on your own timeline and your own terms. If someone cannot wait for you to do that properly, they are not protecting you. They are positioning themselves. Those are different things. Number 4, document what happens to you. If someone is dismissive of your concerns, write it down with the date. If someone threatens you, even informally, even in a driveway on a September afternoon, write it down with the date. If someone tells you that you're confused about something you know clearly, write down what you know and the date you wrote it. A written record, consistent and dated, is what gives your truth staying power. It is what kept me standing 11 years later. It is what Wallace Bridges needed to know exactly who we were dealing with. Write it down. Number 5, know your rights. In every state in this country, a mentally competent adult, regardless of age, has the full legal right to manage her own affairs. No family member can override that without a court order requiring documented medical evidence reviewed by a judge. If someone is telling you otherwise, if someone is suggesting that you are too old or too confused to make your own decisions without any actual medical finding to support that, they are not caring for you. They are controlling you. You have the right to say no. You have the right to ask questions. You have the right to leave any arrangement that is not serving you. Those rights do not expire at 65 or 70 or 85. I have one more thing I need to say. This part is for the women who are listening and thinking about their own family situations right now. Not as the older woman in the story, but as the daughter or the daughter-in-law. If you have made decisions about your mother's or mother-in-law's life, where she lives, what she has access to, who contacts her, I want to ask you a question. Not to shame you. Genuinely, did you do it because it was necessary or because it was easier? There is a real version of family caregiving that comes from love, a version where the older person genuinely needs support, and the family provides it with transparency, full communication, and the older person's full dignity intact. That version exists, and it is honorable. But there is another version where the older person is fine, more than fine, and what is actually happening is that her independence is inconvenient, or her assets are useful, or her questions are uncomfortable. In that version, the language of care is a tool. And if you are doing that version, even a little, even with good intentions mixed in, I'm asking you to stop. Call her. Ask her what she wants. Let her tell you. Then listen without planning your response. She has paid attention her whole life. She is still paying attention now. And if you are the older woman listening, if you are the one in the room whose intelligence is being underestimated, I want you to hear me directly. You are not past your moment. You are in it. Whatever you have built and whatever you know and whatever clarity you have earned by living long enough to see what matters, that is yours. Nobody gets to manage it away from you. Nobody gets to describe you into a story that serves their needs. Nobody gets to call what you see and know clearly a symptom of decline. It is not decline. It is experience. And experience in the right hands is the most powerful thing in any room. I am 75 years old. I live in my house in East Nashville with the covered porch and the vegetable garden. Marcus came to visit in January. He drove down from Franklin on a Saturday, stayed for dinner, asked for seconds on the chicken soup. He told me Theo had been asking when he could come. I told Marcus to tell Theo, whenever he's ready, there's room. Charles has called every Sunday for the past 3 months. We are not where we were before all of this. You cannot unsay 11 years. But we are somewhere new, and somewhere new is not nothing. Dottie has not called. That is her business. What happened between us is documented, settled, and behind me, she is not my work anymore. Renee came for Easter. We made her father's pound cake and sat on the porch until 10 o'clock. She told me about her students and a particularly stubborn 6th grader who refused to believe that plants needed sunlight until she let him run his own experiment and watch his plant fail slowly under a box. She said, "Mom, he cried when it died, but then he understood." I said, "That's the only way some people learn." She said, "Is that what happened with Charles?" I said, "Something like that. I have Wallace's number in my phone. I have my accounts in my name. I have my documents in order. I have my house and my garden and my porch and my people, Paulette, Loretta, Francis, and Gerald, Sylvia, and the Wednesday group. Raymond's reading glasses are in the drawer. His watch is on my wrist. His beans are in the garden. The door is not locked. It is just not open until it should be. There is a difference. If this story found you at the right time, if you are sitting somewhere wondering whether you have the right to protect yourself, I want you to know you do. You have always had it. The question is only whether you decide to use it. Leave me a comment. Tell me one thing you're going to do differently after hearing this. One call you're going to make, one account you're going to check, one conversation you've been putting off. Tell me. I read every one. And if this story belongs to someone you know, a mother, a sister, a friend sitting somewhere wondering if she's being unreasonable for wanting to protect herself, share it. That is how these stories do what they're supposed to do. Take good care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.